Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are diving straight into a really massive, absolutely pivotal question. How exactly should fiscal policy be changed to genuinely improve the financial health of minority communities and broaden the American middle class? We're going to unpack the really complex intersection of our national debt, tax policies, and the direct, on-the-ground financial impact that these huge macroeconomic forces have on everyday Americans and marginalized communities.
Okay, let's kick things off with a number that perfectly sets the stakes here. The Congressional Budget Office projects an unprecedented $100 trillion deficit over the next 3 decades. $100 trillion. And we're already feeling the squeeze right now, with the Treasury confirming a staggering $1.4 trillion deficit in fiscal year 2026 alone. When the national debt spirals like this, the policy levers we pull to fix it have profound, real-world consequences on wealth distribution.
So, to understand how we actually fix this without leaving marginalized communities behind, we're going to break this incredibly complex topic down into 6 clear steps. We'll start with the great fiscal dilemma, look at who bears the burden, explore the corporate tax debate, go beyond the business case, dive into immigration and the economy, and finally, talk about rebuilding the middle class. Let's jump right in. Section 1. The Great Fiscal Dilemma. We really have to start with the grand scale of the fiscal reality facing the U.S. right now. To solve a problem, you first have to understand exactly what's driving it. According to the CBO, the primary drivers of this unprecedented debt aren't necessarily what you might think. It's fundamentally driven by an aging demographic and massive shortfalls in Social Security and Medicare. Meanwhile, if you look at discretionary spending, which includes vital middle-class investments like K-12 education, transportation, and health research, that's actually falling below its historical averages as a share of the economy. So the very things that traditionally build the middle class are already getting squeezed out.
Now, mathematically speaking, we know that stabilizing this massive debt requires either substantial tax increases or really massive program savings. We just can't ignore it. But that begs a very human question. Who actually pays the price when those spending cuts happen?
That brings us to Section 2, Who bears the burden?
Let's look at how recent fiscal choices disproportionately affect different ends of the economic spectrum, because the data here is incredibly revealing. Looking at the numbers from the OBB, which includes a massive $1 trillion in net spending reductions, we see that these cuts are heavily concentrated in our social safety nets. Specifically, Medicaid faces an $819 billion reduction, and SNAP is cut by $187 billion through expanded work requirements. And the real-world impact? The CBO estimates these specific cuts will cause nearly 11 million Americans to lose their health insurance entirely.
And this brilliantly, if a bit darkly, illustrates the distributional impact of these policies. When you combine those program cuts with simultaneous tax cuts, a really stark divide emerges. By 2034, the top 10% of earners are actually projected to see their incomes rise by 2.7%. But the bottom 10% of earners, they're expected to see their incomes decline by 3.1%. This just shows exactly how certain deficit reduction strategies can inadvertently widen the wealth gap, which disproportionately impacts minorities and the lower middle class. Moving right along to Section 3, the corporate tax debate. So if cutting safety nets harms the lower and middle classes, how do we go about rebalancing the economy from the top down to ensure equitable growth? Well, one framework from the source material offers a radically different approach, returning corporate tax rates to pre-Reagan era levels. The logic here isn't just to arbitrarily punish corporations. It's entirely about shifting incentives. By ending the era of highly profitable companies paying zero federal income taxes, the goal is to basically force them to reinvest their profits back into their employees and their physical infrastructure. It redirects capital away from short-term shareholder gains and channels it straight into building a healthy, educated, and well-compensated working class. Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, Beyond the Business Case. This whole idea of structural reinvestment into the workforce brings us directly into the modern corporate debate over diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. Because, who makes up that workforce matters immensely. For years, the corporate world really relied on the business case for diversity, heavily pointing to this famous McKinsey data from 2015 that argued ethnic diversity in executive teams directly yielded financial outperformance. However, recent academic analysis from researchers at Chicago Booth, Texas A&M, and UNC have heavily scrutinized this.
Looking at S&P 500 data across multiple years, they actually found absolutely no concrete evidence of a causal relationship between executive diversity and better subsequent financial performance.
But actually, maybe looking for a purely financial return is the wrong approach entirely. As researchers in the Harvard Business Review brilliantly point out, tying the intrinsic worth of underrepresented groups strictly to corporate profitability can be deeply dehumanizing. They argue that true equity requires fundamental changes to organizational culture, not just an economic justification. I mean, if diversity initiatives fail to deliver promised financial gains, support often just withdraws. Instead, building a strong, diverse middle class should really be rooted in providing equal opportunity and dignity to the American worker, period.
Let's shift gears a bit. Section 5, Immigration and the Economy.
Let's pivot to another massive demographic and economic lever highlighted in our sources that directly impacts the American workforce and the deficit: immigration policy. The sources reveal a fascinating and honestly often overlooked geographic mismatch when it comes to immigration. On an aggregate national level, immigration is a net positive for the federal budget because they capture the vast majority of payroll and income taxes. However, it creates really intense, localized fiscal strains on state and local governments. They are the ones legally mandated to fund immediate community services like K-12 education and emergency medical care, which creates a really complex financial burden right at the local level.
So the crucial takeaway here is that not all immigration has the exact same fiscal impact. The data clearly shows that education and aged arrival are the primary drivers. High-skilled employment-based immigrants, especially those with STEM degrees, produce massive economic surpluses over a 30-year window, often running into the millions of dollars per individual. Conversely, low-skilled immigrants without a high school diploma tend to cost the taxpayer more in government benefits than they contribute in taxes over the long term.
And that brings us to our final act, Section 6, Rebuilding the Middle Class. We need to look at impartial, data-backed pathways to actually fix our staggering debt without crushing the middle class or marginalized groups in the process. A comprehensive proposal from the Manhattan Institute suggests that targeted structural reforms could be the key here. They propose reallocating visas heavily toward high-skilled categories, implementing a wage ranking system for H-1B visas so the highest-paying jobs get priority, and recapturing unused employment-based green cards from previous years. It's essentially a strategy designed to maximize the economic and fiscal surplus of immigration. And guys, the projected results of this shift are staggering. By enacting these high-skilled immigration adjustments, modeling shows we could stabilize our debt by nearly $20 trillion. And increase the GDP by 4.6% over the next 30 years. Best of all, this framework achieves this fiscal balance without cutting the social safety net that vulnerable communities so heavily rely on, and without expanding the overall immigrant share of the population. It simply changes the composition of the workforce to drive economic growth. It's a real game changer.
Ultimately, improving the financial health of minorities and broadening the middle class requires much more than just abstract diversity slogans. It demands targeted, structural reforms. Whether it's rethinking corporate taxation to incentivize reinvestment into everyday workers, or optimizing our immigration system to generate actual fiscal surpluses, the goal is to ensure the equitable distribution of our nation's resources, so the rewards of productivity are genuinely shared across the entire working class. The macroeconomic math we are facing right now is entirely unforgiving. Deficits are absolutely going to force our hand. But the policy choices are still ours to make. We can rely on cuts that devastate the safety net, or we can look to structural, growth-focused reforms. So as we look to the horizon, which path will we choose for the future of the American workforce? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the data.